You think you know your neighbors? In a small southern town, where church bells echo across cotton fields and Friday night football games draw nearly every family to the bleachers, it feels impossible to believe that evil could hide in plain sight. You wave to the mailman, borrow sugar from the woman next door, and leave your doors unlocked because, after all, nothing ever happens here. But what if the killer was sitting right beside you at Sunday service? What if the man who held the hymnal in the pew behind you, or the one who swept the church floors after choir practice, carried a secret darker than anyone could imagine? In October of 2013, Muscogee County, Georgia, a county of less than 3 Azusa residents, learned just how fragile safety could be. Anna Thompson was the musical heartbeat of First Baptist Church. At 42, she was known for her radiant laugh and the graceful way her fingers danced across piano keys. She taught children their first notes, comforted widows with hymns at funerals, and carried the weight of an entire congregation's joy on her shoulders. Anna was the last person anyone could imagine being touched by violence. And yet, on a cool autumn night, her life was stolen in the very parking lot of the church she had served for 15 years. The shock rippled through every porch and pasture. How could a place where cars were recognized by their sound and strangers stood out like neon signs conceal a killer? How could someone commit such a brutal act and melt back into daily life, waving at neighbors, coaching baseball, or shaking hands on Sunday mornings as though nothing had changed? The truth would remain buried for a decade, transforming Anna's death into one of the most haunting cold case files in rural Georgia. For 10 years, whispers filled grocery aisles, prayers hung heavy in the sanctuary, and suspicion corroded the trust that had bound generations together. The answer was always close, but hidden in plain sight, closer than anyone dared to believe. Stay with us until the end, because the truth hiding in these cold case files is more shocking than fiction. Muscogee County, Georgia, is the kind of place where time seems to move more slowly, where fields of cotton ripple like white waves under the fall breeze, and the air is filled with the faint scent of wood smoke as neighbors prepare for another cool southern night. In 2013, fewer than 3 Azusa people called this corner of Georgia home. The rhythms of life were familiar and steady. Friday night football games at the high school, Sunday morning church services, and afternoons where children rode bicycles down gravel roads without a trace of fear in their hearts. It was a place where people still trusted one another enough to leave keys in ignitions, where gossip spread faster than the weather forecast, and where family names carried decades of history. The First Baptist Church stood at the center of this rural community, not just physically, but emotionally. Its brick facade and modest steeple rose above the surrounding farmland, visible for miles across the flat Georgia landscape. For decades, it had been a place where people were baptized, married, and buried. The church wasn't simply a building, it was an anchor, a place where lives intertwined, where joys were celebrated and burdens were carried together. And at the heart of that church, binding together generations of worshipers with music that lifted their voices and soothed their pain, was Anna Thompson. At 42 years old, Anna was known by everyone, though not in the shallow way that small towns often breed familiarity. People didn't just know her name, they knew her laugh, the particular way it filled a room with warmth. They knew the calmness she carried into tense moments, whether she was helping a grieving widow choose hymns for a funeral service or encouraging a nervous 8-year-old to play her first recital piece. She had lived in Muscogee County most of her life, and her identity was woven into the fabric of the community. Anna was the pianist for First Baptist, a role she had held for nearly 15 years. Week after week, she sat at the upright piano with its slightly uneven keys and made it sound like something more majestic. Her gift wasn't just technical skill, it was her ability to take simple hymns and breathe life into them. Congregants often said that even the tone-deaf felt like they could sing when Anna played. Her music gave courage to the hesitant and comfort to the broken. But her impact extended far beyond Sunday services. Anna taught piano lessons in the afternoons, often welcoming children into her small ranch-style home on Maple Street or meeting them in the church sanctuary when their parents couldn't provide a piano at home. For many children, she was their first introduction to music. She taught them patience, discipline, and confidence, values that would outlast any single piece of sheet music. If you ever had a teacher who believed in you more than you did yourself, that's who Anna was to her students. When little Emma Martinez struggled through Beethoven's Für Elise, fingers stumbling on the familiar notes, Anna never frowned or sighed in frustration. Instead, she leaned down, smiled, and said, "You're closer than you think. Let's try again." She believed that every child carried potential, even when they couldn't see it themselves. And that belief often transformed the way those children saw the world. Anna's presence was not just defined by her music, but by her empathy. She had a way of listening that made people feel seen. Neighbors who stopped by her porch to borrow sugar often ended up staying for an hour, confiding in her about worries they hadn't shared with anyone else. She absorbed their troubles, not as gossip but as genuine burdens she carried with them. Her life was an ongoing act of service, rooted not in grand gestures but in small, consistent kindnesses. Yet behind her bright smile and open heart, Anna carried private grief. She and her husband, Marcus, had been married for 12 years. Their small blue-trimmed home with the wraparound porch was filled with laughter and music, but not with the sound of children. They had tried for years to start a family, enduring rounds of quiet disappointment that only their closest friends knew about. Each negative pregnancy test was a silent heartbreak, another reminder of the life they longed for but could not have. Anna rarely spoke of this pain, but it showed in subtle ways, the way she lingered just a little longer when cradling a friend's newborn, or how she poured herself into teaching children, channeling the love she couldn't give her own into nurturing theirs. Her mother's long illness had also left scars. Cancer had claimed her life just a few years earlier, and Anna had been at her bedside every step of the way. The sanctuary of First Baptist had been her refuge during that time. She would sit at the piano late at night, long after others had gone home, playing hymns as if the notes themselves could hold her broken heart together. Her resilience was not born from ease but from struggle. She had faced suffering and found a way to transform it into something beautiful, a gift she shared with everyone around her. In a town where everyone knew everyone, Anna was not just another resident. She was the thread that stitched people together. Pastor William Burke often said from the pulpit that her music carried the congregation in ways his sermons never could. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, the church's eldest member, often reminded younger families how she had watched Anna grow from a child balancing on blocks to reach the pedals into the woman who now carried the weight of their worship. To many, Anna was more than a pianist. She was the spirit of their community. That's what made what happened next so unfathomable. Violence did not belong in Muscogee County, at least not the kind of violence that stole lives. Domestic disputes, the occasional drunk driver, maybe a burglary gone wrong. Those were the sorts of things Sheriff Bobby Chen and his 2 deputies were accustomed to. Murder was something that happened in Atlanta, not in a quiet farming town. The very idea that someone might target Anna Thompson, of all people, felt like a violation of the laws of nature itself. As autumn deepened and the leaves turned shades of crimson and gold, preparations began for the harvest festival. Families decorated their porches with pumpkins, children rehearsed songs for school plays, and the church choir practiced hymns for Thanksgiving Sunday. Life appeared as it always had, steady and familiar. But beneath the surface, fate was quietly setting the stage for a tragedy that would upend everything. The parking lot of First Baptist was a gathering place as much as the sanctuary itself. After services, families lingered there, swapping stories and catching up on news. It was where teenagers planned bonfires, where elderly couples reminisced, and where Anna often stood, laughing and chatting long after her fingers had left the piano keys. To think that the same patch of asphalt, lit by a single amber street lamp, would soon become the site of unthinkable violence was beyond comprehension. Anna Thompson embodied the innocence of rural community life. She represented trust, kindness, and the idea that good people could live unguarded lives without fear. Her story was not just about who she was, but about what she symbolized. To lose Anna would mean more than the loss of a gifted musician or a beloved friend. It would mean the shattering of the illusion that Muscogee County was immune to the darkness that plagued the wider world. That illusion would soon crumble. The town that believed it knew everything about its people was about to discover that it didn't. The killer was not a stranger passing through, not an outsider seeking opportunity. The killer was someone who blended into the fabric of daily life, someone who had shared meals, shaken hands, and nodded politely in the same pews where Anna's music soared. And as the sun set on that October evening, painting the cotton fields in golden light, Anna stayed behind at the piano, working through a difficult passage, chasing perfection with the dedication she always gave to her craft. Outside, the street lamp flickered to life, casting long shadows across the empty lot. Her white Honda Civic waited in its usual place, steady and familiar. To Anna, it was just another Sunday night. To Muscogee County, it was the moment before everything changed. Sunday evenings in Muscogee County were always quiet. By the time choir practice wrapped up at First Baptist, the main street shops had long closed. The last customers lingering at the diner had paid their bills, and the sound of pickup trucks pulling into driveways filled the air. Families retreated to their living rooms, the glow of televisions flickering against lace curtains, while the farmland that surrounded the town sank into darkness, broken only by porch lights and the occasional lantern on a barn wall. On October 20th, 2013, the choir gathered as they always did, 17 voices blending together inside the brick church that had stood since 1962. They practiced hymns for the upcoming Harvest Festival, their songs carrying through the sanctuary and into the cool autumn night. By 9 o'clock, most members had packed up their hymnals and walked out into the parking lot, their laughter and conversation drifting into the quiet rural air. Anna stayed behind, as she often did. Perfectionist by nature, she wanted to run through the Thanksgiving anthem one more time, fingers lingering on tricky passages that demanded precision. The piano had become her refuge, her companion, and she was never in a rush to leave its side. Inside the sanctuary, the light from the stained glass windows had faded to shadows, leaving only the soft yellow glow of ceiling fixtures. The silence of the church at night was not empty, but expectant, as if the walls themselves held on to the songs and prayers that had been carried within them for decades. By the time Anna finally closed her music book, the parking lot outside was deserted. Only her white Honda Civic remained, parked beneath the amber streetlight that stood like a sentinel on the edge of the church property. She walked through the side door, sheet music tucked under one arm, her purse slung over the other shoulder. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. That was the last moment anyone saw her alive. The next morning, Marcus Thompson awoke at his usual time, 5:30 a.m. A habit carved into his body after decades of working at O'Sullivan's Auto Repair. He reached across the bed, expecting to feel the familiar warmth of his wife beside him. Instead, his hand met cold sheets. At first, he thought little of it. Anna sometimes stayed late at church to practice, losing track of time. Maybe she had fallen asleep at the piano, her head resting on folded arms. But as he sat up and looked at her side of the bed, neatly made, untouched, pillow still carrying the faint scent of lavender shampoo, his chest tightened. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed her number. It rang 5 times before her cheerful voicemail message played. "Hi, you've reached Anna Thompson. I'm probably at the piano, so leave a message and I'll call you back as soon as I can." Her voice, so alive and light, cut through the early morning silence, and Marcus felt unease gnaw at him. Anna always answered. Always. Especially when he called. Slipping on his work boots, Marcus grabbed his keys and drove the familiar 4-minute route to the church. The sky was still gray with the first light of dawn as he turned onto the county road that led to the sanctuary. His stomach dropped when he saw Anna's car exactly where she always parked, in the spot closest to the side door. Relief flickered for a moment. She was probably still inside, maybe asleep at the piano. But then he noticed the driver's side door. It wasn't closed. It hung slightly ajar, the interior light faintly glowing. Imagine walking up to that parking lot, seeing the car door ajar, her purse scattered across the asphalt, papers fluttering in the morning breeze. Every instinct in your body tells you something is wrong, but you keep moving, because the alternative, to stop and accept the truth, is unbearable. Marcus's hands shook as he bent down and picked up her purse. Lipstick, a hairbrush, coins, and a folded church bulletin lay strewn across the pavement. He whispered her name, half hoping she would step out from the shadows, laugh at his worry, and say she had just been clumsy. But the only reply was the rustle of leaves carried by the morning wind. He walked around to the passenger side, peering through the window. Sheet music was scattered across the seats, pages bent and curling, the hymnal still open to "Be Thou My Vision." His throat tightened. Something terrible had interrupted her routine. Then he saw her. Behind the car, lying on the cold asphalt, was Anna. Her body was twisted in a way that spoke not of sleep or accident, but of violence. Her face, the same face that had smiled at him over breakfast the previous morning, was turned toward the church, as if even in her final moments she had sought the sanctuary that had been her refuge all her life. Autumn leaves, once symbols of beauty, now lay around her like a tragic carpet, some stained dark with the truth Marcus did not want to recognize. He staggered back, his mind rebelling against the scene. First came disbelief. Maybe she had fainted. Maybe she had fallen. He dropped to his knees, shaking her shoulder, calling her name. But her body was cold, and the stillness was absolute. Disbelief gave way to horror, and horror to a wave of grief so deep it threatened to pull him under. His phone slipped in his hand as he dialed 911, his voice breaking as he tried to form words. "It's my wife, Anna. She's here, behind the church. She's not moving. Why would someone hurt her? She never hurt anyone. She just played piano and loved everybody." The dispatcher tried to calm him, but the recording would later become Exhibit 1 in a case file that would swell to thousands of pages. When Sheriff Bobby Chen and Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived minutes later, the scene was already burned into Marcus's mind. He stood by helplessly as yellow tape was stretched around the lot, as deputies moved cautiously, documenting, photographing, securing evidence. He watched as strangers in uniforms knelt beside the woman he loved, treating her as evidence, her body as a case. He wanted to scream, to beg them to see her not as a victim, but as Anna, his wife, the pianist, the heartbeat of the church. The sanctuary that had been filled with her music just hours earlier now stood silent, its piano keys untouched, hymns left unfinished. And outside, in the parking lot, Marcus's life shattered into before and after. From hope to disbelief to horror, his collapse was complete. The man who had teased Anna about always parking in the same spot, who had listened to her play lullabies in a house that never held children, who had leaned on her strength when his own failed, now stood alone, a widower not yet able to grasp the word. And from Muscogee County, the clock had just started ticking on a mystery that would consume the next decade. The arrival of law enforcement on that October morning transformed the church parking lot from a place of fellowship into a crime scene. Sheriff Bobby Chen, a man respected for his calm leadership in a county where law enforcement usually meant calming down a quarrel between neighbors or chasing stray cattle off the road, stood frozen for a moment. Murder wasn't part of Muscogee County's vocabulary. His department was built for traffic tickets, for stolen tractors, for Friday night patrols when teenagers snuck into old barns. But now, under the pale dawn light, he found himself staring at the unimaginable. The lifeless body of Anna Thompson, the woman who had played piano at his own daughter's baptism. The responsibility was heavy, and Chen knew he didn't have the tools to carry it alone. That's when Detective Sarah Mitchell stepped forward. Sarah had transferred to Muscogee County 3 years earlier, leaving behind Atlanta's chaos of gang violence and drug turf wars. She had wanted peace, a slower rhythm of life, a place where crime scenes didn't involve flashing neon lights and gunshots in crowded streets. In Atlanta, she had learned to compartmentalize, to separate victims from their names, their families, their stories. Out there, homicide was routine. But here in Muscogee County, everything was personal. Everyone knew Anna. Everyone had heard her music. And that changed everything. Sarah pushed through the disbelief and did what training demanded. Preserve the scene. Document everything. She popped open the trunk of her patrol car and pulled out rolls of crime scene tape, the kind that had gathered dust for years because there had been no need for it. She stretched it around the parking lot, enclosing Anna's Honda Civic, her scattered belongings, and the patch of asphalt where her body lay. The yellow barrier fluttered in the morning breeze, a jarring symbol of violence in a community that still left doors unlocked at night. Her next task was photography. She pulled out the department's aging digital camera, the same one they had used for fender benders and stolen property reports. The lens was smudged, the battery nearly dead. She made it work, crouching down, angling the device, trying to capture every detail. The spilled lipstick, the sheet music crumpled on the ground, the leaves stained with something no one wanted to acknowledge. Each click echoed in her ears like a fragile attempt to freeze time, to preserve truth before it slipped away. She knew the Georgia Bureau of Investigation would send a forensics team, but they were 45 minutes away in Columbus. By then, contamination could erase critical evidence. Deputies, unused to homicide procedure, shifted uncomfortably, unsure how close they should stand. One bent down instinctively to pick up Anna's purse, and Sarah barked at him to stop, her voice sharper than she intended. She had to train them on the spot. Gloves on, every movement recorded, nothing touched without documentation. This wasn't Atlanta, where homicide units operated like clockwork. Here, improvisation was the only option. The first canvas of the neighborhood revealed little. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, who lived directly across from the church, had gone to bed at 9 as she always did, falling asleep to her evening programs and waking at 6 to her alarm. She heard nothing unusual. Beyond her, the nearest house sat nearly a quarter-mile away. The rural quiet that had once been Muscogee County's charm was now its curse. No witnesses, no cameras, no one awake to see what happened. Sarah walked the perimeter, her boots crunching over leaves. Near the side door of the church, she noticed faint impressions in the soil, the kind that might be footprints. She marked them carefully, but the ground was soft, disturbed, unlikely to hold detail. A partial shoe print, perhaps, but no guarantee it could be matched. Inside the church, the piano still bore Anna's fingerprints of devotion. Hymnals were open, music sheets stacked in careful order. Nothing seemed out of place, yet Sarah felt the silence like a scream. This was no random act. Whoever had done this had waited, had known her habits, had chosen this moment deliberately. If you were the detective staring at hundreds of empty leads, no witnesses, no clear motive, a parking lot too dark for security cameras, would you still believe justice was possible? Would you still have faith that somewhere, hidden in the silence, lay a truth waiting to be uncovered? Or would you feel the creeping dread that this case might fade into the background, another wound in the fabric of the community that would never truly heal? By mid-morning, the GBI team finally arrived. Their equipment looked almost futuristic compared to Muscogee County's worn tools. They set about swabbing surfaces, bagging fibers, and collecting trace evidence. Sarah handed over her photographs, her notes, her observations, determined not to let the case slip through the cracks. But she also knew the truth. The lab in Atlanta was overwhelmed. Non-priority cases often sat for months, sometimes years. Marcus, sitting in the back of a deputy's cruiser, rocked back and forth in shock. He had answered every question the deputies asked, but his voice was distant, hollow. His grief was visible in every tremor of his hands. Neighbors began to gather at the church fence, whispers traveling faster than the sheriff could contain them. Tears rolled down faces, suspicion flickered in eyes. For the first time in living memory, Muscogee County was afraid. And Sarah knew the clock was already ticking. Evidence degraded by the hour as memories blurred with each retelling, and fear spread like wildfire. She worked long into the afternoon, sketching maps of the lot, marking locations, cross-checking timelines. The GBI bagged a Coca-Cola can found 30 feet from the car. It seemed out of place, no vending machines at the church, no reason for it to be there. They swabbed the opening for DNA, though in 2013 the technology was limited. At the time, the sample proved inconclusive. It would sit forgotten in an evidence box for nearly a decade. By dusk, the parking lot had been cleared. Anna's body was transported to the state medical examiner's office in Atlanta. Deputies rolled up the tape, leaving behind an empty lot, as though nothing had happened. But the echoes remained. For Sarah, the image of Anna's body framed by that church door would never leave her. She returned to the sheriff's office and began what would become the thickest file in Muscogee County history. She typed until her fingers cramped, cataloging every item, every observation, every inconsistency. She knew that, without meticulous documentation, Anna's murder risked slipping into obscurity. She wrote the phrase in her notes like a warning. Without proper forensics, Anna's case risked becoming another cold case file. At 18 minutes into this story, here is where we pause. If you've stayed with us this far, hit like. It helps bring forgotten cold case files back into the light. The investigation unfolded with frustration. Interviews with family, friends, and students revealed nothing but praise. No ex-boyfriends, no feuds, no financial disputes. Anna lived a life so transparent it seemed impossible to imagine who could harbor such violence against her. Even Marcus, as heartbroken as he was, became a subject of quiet speculation. In small towns, suspicion always lingers closest to home. People whispered in grocery lines, in factory break rooms, even in the pews of the very church where Anna had played. Sarah refused to let rumor replace evidence. She conducted interviews late into the night, knocking on doors, pressing for timelines, asking questions no one wanted to answer. But with every "I don't know" and "I didn't see anything," the weight grew heavier. She knew the community expected answers quickly. Yet the truth remained elusive, slipping through her grasp like water. The county courthouse basement served as evidence storage, a converted closet lined with metal shelves. Boxes of minor theft cases and DUI reports now sat beside the most serious homicide Muscogee County had ever seen. The conditions were far from ideal. No climate control, no advanced cataloging system. Sarah did her best, labeling each bag with obsessive detail, fighting against the creeping dread that crucial DNA might degrade before it was ever tested. She called in favors from former colleagues in Atlanta, pushing for lab work to be expedited. But the backlog was immense. She was told to wait. Weeks stretched into months. Leads grew cold. Each morning, she returned to the case file, reading and rereading her own notes, hunting for patterns that refused to appear. At night, she drove past the church, headlights sweeping across the lot where Anna had fallen. She parked across the road, engine idling, staring at the building that had once symbolized peace. Now, to Sarah, it was a crime scene that wouldn't let her rest. She replayed possibilities. Did the killer wait inside the church? Did he follow Anna from home? Did he know her routine so intimately that he could predict when she would be alone? Every scenario led to more questions, and each day without answers deepened the fracture in the community. Parents walked children to bus stops. Women double-checked locks on doors that had never before been bolted. Widows installed alarms for the first time in their lives. The town that had once trusted everyone now trusted no one. Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing against her. The case wasn't just about evidence. It was about restoring a community's faith in safety. But without leads, without clarity, even the most skilled detective could feel the darkness closing in. And as autumn faded into winter, the yellow leaves gave way to bare branches, and Muscogee County braced itself for a long season of fear. In the days that followed Anna Thompson's murder, Muscogee County became a different place. The familiar rhythm of rural life faltered, replaced by a sense of unease that spread from farmhouse to farmhouse, church pew to grocery aisle. A community that had once felt immune to the world's dangers now found itself asking questions it never thought possible. At first, grief bound people together. Vigils were held in the church sanctuary, candles flickering against stained glass as neighbors wept openly. But grief soon gave way to something darker, suspicion. In a county where everyone knew everyone, the very intimacy that once fostered trust now fueled paranoia. If no stranger had been seen lurking around, then the killer must have been one of their own. Marcus Thompson, Anna's husband, bore the heaviest weight. Friends embraced him, whispered condolences, brought casseroles and offers of prayer. Yet behind his back, conversations shifted. In countless true crime stories, the spouse is always the first suspect. People knew Marcus as a quiet, hard-working man, a mechanic who never raised his voice in public. Still, the absence of other suspects turned glances toward him. In the grocery store, a conversation would stop when he entered an aisle. At the auto shop where he worked, co-workers offered sympathy but avoided his eyes. It was an accusation, not outright, but it was suspicion all the same. For Marcus, the whispers compounded his grief. He had lost his wife, the partner who had carried his dreams through 12 years of marriage. Now he faced a second loss, the quiet erosion of his reputation, the steady drip of doubt from people who had once trusted him. Parents, once content to let their children ride bicycles to school or play until the sun dipped below the horizon, changed their routines overnight. Mothers walked their kids to bus stops. Fathers waited outside school doors in the afternoons. The same gravel roads where children had once laughed now lay empty. Fear had seeped into childhood itself. Widows who had lived alone for decades, secure in the knowledge that Muscogee County was safe, began to bolt doors and install alarms. Hardware stores reported a sudden spike in sales of deadbolts and motion sensor lights. Houses that had stood unlocked for generations were now fortified against an unseen threat. Porch conversations shifted from weather and crops to locks, sirens, and who might be hiding what. Even the heart of the community, First Baptist Church, struggled under the weight of fear. Pastor William Burke had stood at that pulpit for nearly 20 years, offering messages of comfort and faith. But in the weeks after Anna's death, his words faltered. He spoke of Job's trials, of God's presence in suffering, yet his voice carried the same tremor that haunted his congregation. The sanctuary itself felt altered. The piano bench sat empty, sheet music stacked neatly as if waiting for hands that would never return. Every hymn sung in that room carried a note of absence, a reminder of the void Anna had left behind. Could you look your neighbor in the eye, knowing one of them might be a murderer? Could you shake hands at the end of a church service, share a pew, pass the communion plate, all while wondering if the person beside you carried the guilt of Anna's death? That question lingered in every handshake, every nod across the street, every hesitant smile. The suspicion didn't always show in words, but it pulsed beneath the surface of daily life, eroding the foundation of trust that had defined Muscogee County for generations. Detective Sarah Mitchell felt it in every interview she conducted. Neighbors were polite but guarded, their answers clipped, eyes darting as though even conversation could make them complicit. She knew what suspicion could do. It fractured communities as surely as it fractured families. Each passing day without answers deepened the divide. The psychological toll was enormous. Muscogee County had built its identity on safety, on the certainty that people looked out for one another. That certainty had been ripped away. What replaced it was a collective anxiety, a creeping dread that the enemy was not outside, but within. The concept of home had always been synonymous with safety. Now, home was where locks clicked twice and curtains were drawn tight. Marcus wandered through this altered landscape like a ghost. He attended vigils, sat in church, went to work, but everything he touched carried the stain of suspicion. He replayed the morning of Anna's death in his mind, searching for something he could have done differently, some warning sign he had missed. His grief became inseparable from guilt, even if he bore no responsibility. For children, Anna's absence was equally devastating. Young Emma Martinez asked her mother one morning why her piano teacher wasn't coming back. Her mother, unable to explain the brutality of murder to an 8-year-old, simply said, "She's with God now." But the child's response pierced through the fragile calm. Then, who will teach me piano? That question carried the weight of innocence lost. The church community fractured too. Some believed continuing the music program would honor Anna's memory. Others felt it was disrespectful to fill her bench so soon. Arguments that had never existed before erupted in fellowship halls and after-service gatherings. Fear bred division, and division bred resentment. In small towns, unity is survival. Muscogee County had always thrived on collective strength. But now, unity itself was a casualty. Each neighbor looked sideways at the other. Each door that closed behind a deadbolt symbolized the collapse of a social contract. The killer hadn't just taken Anna's life. He had taken the community's innocence, and in doing so, left wounds that would not heal quickly. The shock waves of Anna's death didn't stop at the county line. News traveled to Columbus, to Atlanta, to other corners of Georgia. But for those who lived in Muscogee County, it wasn't just a headline, it was the daily air they breathed. Every step into the grocery store, every drive past the church, every Sunday spent in silence where music once lifted their hearts. The question loomed. If someone could murder Anna Thompson, the woman who embodied kindness, who gave her life to service, then what was anyone safe from? That question haunted Muscogee County, and no sermon, no locked door, no whispered reassurance could erase it. The erosion of collective trust was complete. What remained was a community bound not by shared joy, but by shared fear. By November, just 3 weeks after Anna's death, Detective Sarah Mitchell finally received what seemed like a break. A young gas station attendant in Columbus, 45 minutes away, called the sheriff's office with a shaky voice. He claimed he had seen a man pull into the station late on the night of Anna's murder. The customer was described as middle-aged, white, average build, driving a dark pickup truck. What caught the attendant's eye was the man's hands, stained with what looked like blood. Sarah rushed to interview him. She had driven that highway many times before. It was the only real artery connecting Muscogee County to the city. If someone had fled the scene that night, this road would have carried them away. The attendant, 22-year-old Kevin Walsh, insisted the man had acted strangely. He'd paid cash, avoided eye contact, and left in a hurry. For weeks, the department poured resources into the lead. They cross-referenced every dark pickup truck registered within 50 miles. Dozens of men were called in, questioned, asked to account for their whereabouts. Neighbors noticed investigators prowling driveways, deputies snapping photographs of parked trucks. It created friction in a community already frayed by grief and suspicion. But the closer Sarah looked, the more the story unraveled. Walsh hesitated under repeated questioning. First, he said the man had a beard. Then he said clean-shaven. At one point, he claimed the stains were dripping blood. Later, that they were faint smears. Finally, under pressure, he admitted he wasn't sure at all. The lighting at the gas station had been poor. Maybe it wasn't blood. Maybe it was grease. Maybe even red paint. The entire lead collapsed in her hands. 2 months of effort, strained resources, and growing tension among residents, all for nothing. Sarah filed the report with a sinking heart, knowing every dead end eroded the community's already fragile faith. And then came the jewelry. In the spring of 2014, a hiker found a silver bracelet and wedding band, half buried beneath leaves near a creek bed 10 miles from the church. When Marcus confirmed they were Anna's, hope flared again. Detectives descended on the wooded area, combing the ground for fibers, footprints, anything that might reveal the killer's path. Local news outlets finally took notice, their cameras capturing deputies carrying evidence bags. For the first time in months, Muscogee County felt a surge of cautious optimism. The idea that Anna's belongings had been discarded near the creek suggested movement, a suspect familiar with back roads and hidden trails. Families gathered in living rooms, whispering that maybe justice was finally within reach. But forensic analysis told a different story. The bracelet and ring had not weathered months of rain, sun, and soil. The metal was too clean, the soil too loose. Experts concluded they had been planted recently, within the last 2 weeks. Whoever had placed them there wasn't disposing of evidence. They were staging a discovery. The revelation struck Sarah like a physical blow. Someone had access to Anna's belongings after her death. Someone had deliberately tried to steer the investigation in the wrong direction. Worse, it meant the killer wasn't simply hiding. He was watching. He was manipulating. He had stepped back into the narrative, using the community's desperation for closure as his stage. What would you think if someone planted evidence, just to toy with investigators? What would it feel like to know the killer wasn't satisfied with taking a life, but wanted to control the story that followed, turning grief into a twisted game? For Sarah, the insight was chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion. It wasn't a chaotic outburst that spiraled out of control. This was calculated. The killer wasn't just hiding from justice. He was savoring the ability to deceive, to watch the town grasp at false hope, then crumble again when the truth emerged. In small towns, rumors spread like wildfire. News of the planted evidence leaked quickly. Neighbors who had begun to breathe easier tightened their locks again. Marcus, already staggering under suspicion, now faced a cruel new layer of torment. If Anna's jewelry hadn't been there since the night of her murder, then someone had returned to it later. Someone who still had pieces of her life. It was psychological warfare. The killer hadn't just taken Anna, he was eroding the very fabric of the investigation. He had turned Muscogee County into his audience, dangling false clues like bait, watching from the shadows as detectives and citizens alike tore themselves apart with speculation. Sarah documented it all. She typed furiously, noting every inconsistency, every timeline. She made a grim entry in her growing file. False evidence piled on, turning Anna's case into a cold case file defined by manipulation. The phrase lingered like a curse. Each lead that collapsed deepened the case's descent into unsolved territory. Each planted clue widened the gap between truth and deception. And with each failure, the killer's sense of control seemed to grow. By summer, the community's hope had hardened into cynicism. People stopped asking Sarah for updates. They stopped attending prayer vigils. They stopped believing justice would come. Anna's death, once a rallying point, now hung in the air like a bitter reminder of how powerless they all were. And somewhere in Muscogee County, the killer was still out there, blending into daily life, shaking hands, maybe even singing in the pews where Anna's piano once filled the sanctuary with grace. By 2015, the shock of Anna Thompson's murder had shifted into something heavier: endurance. The first months had been marked by vigils, candlelight prayers, and late-night phone calls among neighbors who whispered their fears. But years stretched on without answers, and the community learned the painful art of living alongside silence. Detective Sarah Mitchell, once the engine of the investigation, carried the case like a stone in her chest. For years she filed reports, knocked on doors, drove the same back roads searching for details she might have missed. Each morning, she pulled open the metal cabinet in the courthouse basement, stared at the growing stack of files, and forced herself to keep believing. But, with each passing year, that belief drained. The case file expanded relentlessly: witness interviews, lab reports, photographs, maps. By 2017, it had grown to over 2,000 pages, a weighty binder of failure. Deputies joked grimly that the Thompson case could stop a bullet if you dropped it in front of you. Sarah didn't laugh. She knew the truth. All that paper, all those hours, still amounted to nothing. The pressure of expectation gnawed at her. Muscogee County residents saw her as their last hope. Every time she walked into the grocery store or sat in a church pew, people's eyes followed. They asked quietly, "Any progress?" She always answered carefully, but inside she felt her own hope slipping away. After 7 years of chasing shadows, Sarah made the hardest decision of her career. In 2020, she transferred to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, leaving Muscogee County behind. Her departure felt like another funeral. The community respected her dedication, but they couldn't ignore the symbolism. If even Sarah Mitchell, with all her experience and fire, couldn't solve the case, then who could? The file remained, locked in a cabinet, visited only occasionally by new deputies who flipped through the photographs like relics from another lifetime. Some tried to take fresh looks, but without resources, training, or leads, their efforts went nowhere. And so, the years passed. For Marcus Thompson, survival took a different form. Grief had carved deep lines into his face, and whispers of suspicion had hollowed out what little peace remained. But even a broken heart seeks company. By 2019, Marcus remarried, a widow from the next county who understood the language of loss. Their life together was kind, supportive, even loving. Yet Anna's shadow never left. In their living room, framed photographs of her still hung beside new memories. Marcus never forgot the sound of her laughter, the sight of her car door ajar under the amber streetlight. His new wife didn't ask him to forget. She simply stood beside him in silence when memories became too heavy to carry alone. The church changed too. Anna's piano bench remained empty for months, as though the congregation could not bear to replace her. Eventually, a younger musician stepped in, but the music never sounded the same. Congregants listened politely, but in their hearts, they compared every note to the woman whose fingers had once brought hymns to life. By 2020, Anna's murder was no longer the topic of every conversation. Life in Muscogee County moved forward, children grew, businesses opened and closed, the seasons turned as they always had. But beneath the surface, the wound remained. People still locked doors. Parents still watched children more carefully. And every October, when leaves turned the same colors they had on the night Anna died, the memory returned like a ghost. The sheriff's office no longer held press conferences or offered updates. There were no updates to give. Reporters had stopped calling. News crews stopped visiting. The community stopped asking because they already knew the answer. The case was frozen. In Sarah's absence, the files gathered dust in their metal cabinet until they became not just records but symbols of futility. And by 2020, it was just another cold case file haunting the sheriff's office. The phrase felt bitterly cruel. Anna had been more than a name, more than another file. She was the music that bound a congregation together, the neighbor who carried other people's burdens, the woman whose kindness seemed unending. To reduce her to a case file was to strip her of humanity. And yet, that was the reality. Her life, her death, her investigation, all sealed in paper and cardboard, stacked alongside burglaries and petty thefts. If you lived in that town, could you sit in church knowing the killer might be in the pew behind you? Could you bow your head in prayer, trusting that the person offering a handshake afterward wasn't the same one who had taken Anna's life? That was the unspoken question every Sunday, hanging in the air like smoke. Some people stopped attending services altogether, unable to face the empty piano bench or the possibility of brushing shoulders with a murderer. Others clung to faith with desperation, filling the silence with hymns that rang hollow but at least provided ritual. The sanctuary, once a place of safety, had become a place of suspicion. The psychological toll was enormous. Communities thrive on shared trust, trust that your neighbor will watch your house, trust that your pastor will comfort you, trust that your law enforcement can protect you. When trust erodes, so does identity. By the end of the decade, Muscogee County was no longer the same town. It was fractured, quieter, more careful. Neighbors still waved, but with caution. Friendships endured, but without the same openness. Marcus carried this fracture most of all. He lived his new life, yes, but every walk into town, every stop at the hardware store, every church service carried the same haunting thought. Anna's killer was still here. Somewhere in the aisles, somewhere in the sanctuary, somewhere in the background of daily life. And in truth, Marcus was right. For nearly a decade, Anna Thompson's case sat buried in the filing cabinet like a scar the community had learned to live with. But in January 2023, fresh eyes arrived in Muscogee County. Detective James Parker, a transfer from Gwinnett County, was known for his stubborn approach to cold cases. Where others saw dead ends, Parker saw unfinished puzzles. He began the way every seasoned detective does, by going back to the beginning. He requested every box, every page, every scrap of evidence tied to Anna's murder. For weeks, he lived inside the file, memorizing the photos, witness statements, and timelines. He walked the church grounds at different hours, imagining what Anna saw, what the killer planned. He retraced the steps of Sarah Mitchell, honoring the work she had left behind but refusing to accept that the trail had gone cold forever. One item caught his attention: a Coca-Cola can, cataloged as Exhibit 47B. Found 30 feet from Anna's car, it had been bagged, photographed, even swabbed for DNA back in 2013. But at that time, technology wasn't advanced enough to extract a usable profile. The report had labeled it inconclusive, and the can was shelved, almost forgotten. Parker believed in details. He had solved cases before on fragments: one hair, one partial print, one overlooked receipt. To him, the Coke can was not trash. It was a clue left behind by someone too confident to hide it. He ordered the can to be retested using the latest DNA extraction methods. Weeks passed while the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's lab worked on the sample. Unlike 2013, forensic science in 2023 could now amplify genetic material from microscopic traces, even those degraded over time. It was tedious, meticulous work. Parker kept his expectations low. He had learned long ago that hope could betray as sharply as failure. But when the call came from Dr. Angela Vasquez, the forensic biologist, he felt the weight of 10 years shift. The DNA profile was complete, and it matched. The name stunned everyone. Richard Chen. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't some shadowy figure slipping through town. He was the church's volunteer janitor, a man trusted with keys, someone who had mopped the sanctuary floors and stacked chairs after fellowship suppers. Even more shocking, he was the nephew of Sheriff Bobby Chen himself. Richard had even been interviewed in the early days, not as a suspect, but as a helpful witness. He had answered questions politely, described the evening routines, and even joined the search when Anna was first reported missing. For 10 years he blended back into life, working at the local sawmill, sitting in church pews, waving to neighbors who never thought twice. What if the man sweeping your church floors, shaking your hand every Sunday, was the killer? What if the murderer wasn't a stranger in the night, but someone you had trusted with the most sacred spaces of your life? The revelation struck Muscogee County like a lightning bolt. It wasn't just the crime itself that horrified people, it was the deception. Richard Chen had hidden in plain sight, attending vigils, mourning with neighbors, nodding along to sermons delivered only feet from where he had ended Anna's life. Parker pushed for a swift arrest. When deputies arrived at Richard's modest rental house, he didn't resist. He didn't shout, didn't deny. Witnesses said he seemed almost relieved, as if the weight of a decade-long lie had finally grown too heavy. In his garage, investigators found clippings of Anna's case preserved like trophies, and photographs of her taken secretly before her death, evidence of an obsession that had escalated into violence. For Sheriff Chen, the discovery was shattering. The case that had haunted his career now carried his family's name. Within hours of Richard's arrest, the sheriff resigned, unable to reconcile his duty to justice with the betrayal in his own bloodline. And yet, for the first time in 10 years, Muscogee County glimpsed resolution. A crime that had fractured their trust was finally being pieced back together, not by chance, but by science. Modern DNA gave this cold case file a second chance at justice. 8. At 50 minutes into this story, here's where I'll ask you, our viewers, for your voice. Comment below. Do you think modern science will solve more cold case files like Anna's? Your thoughts not only honor her memory, but keep alive the idea that justice delayed is not justice denied. Anna's case was proof. Silence is never the end. With persistence, patience, and technology, even the most carefully hidden truths can be unearthed. And sometimes, the very person you trusted most is the one who had been hiding the darkest secret all along. 3 days after his arrest, Richard Chen sat in an interview room at the Muscogee County Sheriff's Department. Calm, almost detached, he confessed. His words spilled out not with rage, but with the chilling clarity of a man who had lived with his secret for a decade. He told investigators it had begun with a simple rejection. Weeks before Anna's murder, he had asked her to dinner after a Sunday service. She had declined with the same gentle kindness she gave everyone, but Richard twisted that kindness into insult. In his mind, her politeness became mockery, her compassion became manipulation. He began watching her, waiting outside the church, following her with a telephoto lens, collecting moments of her life as if they belonged to him. The night of her murder, he hid inside the church supply closet until the choir had gone home. He admitted he waited for the sanctuary to grow silent, then confronted her. What he intended, he said, was to force her to acknowledge him. But when Anna resisted, when she fought, his obsession snapped into violence. He left her lifeless body on the cold asphalt just steps from the sanctuary she had served so faithfully. The community's grief deepened into something darker: betrayal. This was not a stranger passing through. This was the janitor who swept their church floors, who sang their hymns, who bowed his head in the same pews. He had been among them every Sunday, hiding behind a mask of helpfulness and humility, while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. The revelation crushed Sheriff Bobby Chen most of all. Richard was his nephew, family by blood. The man who had haunted Muscogee County for 10 years had shared his name. Within hours, the sheriff resigned, his voice breaking as he told reporters he could no longer lead a department while carrying such a personal wound. The betrayal cut deeper than death. Anna's loss had wounded the community, but Richard's confession tore at its foundation. Trust was gone, not just in him, but in the very fabric of neighborly life. If it were your family, could you ever forgive a betrayal like this? Could you ever sing in the same pews, knowing the man beside you once carried such darkness? That was the question Muscogee County would wrestle with long after Richard Chen was sentenced. Richard Chen's guilty plea closed the legal chapter of Anna Thompson's murder, but it could never erase the decade of fear and suspicion that scarred Muscogee County. Justice was delivered, yes, but the wound remained. The church pews still felt emptier, the music quieter, the trust between neighbors fragile in ways it had never been before. If it were your town, could you ever feel safe again, knowing the killer had worshiped beside you, swept the floors of your sanctuary, and hidden behind a smile for 10 long years? That is the legacy of betrayal Muscogee County must carry. For Anna's family, for Marcus, for every child she once taught to play piano, her memory deserves more than silence. Subscribe and share this story, because every voice helps keep these cold case files alive. Justice delayed should never mean justice denied.